Well, all I have to say is that we are back. Hey everybody, I'm Brady Michael, and I will once again be hogging the mic. And I was debating whether or not I should call this Season 2 or just Episode 11. But with college football around the corner, college football never ends. It's always in season. As the great Josh Pate says, there is no off season. It's going to be Season 2. It's college football. New show. That's pretty much all the show's going to have today. And it's a new me. So on the show today, we have fall camp intel for each SEC team. And I'm no insider, but I'll listen around, I'll read around, I'll find my ways, and I'll bring you what I've found today. You have quarterback battles with 1 week left before week 0, and still a handful to dive into, and some battles that may not ever get a true answer. I'm looking at you, Nick Saban. And alongside news for each team out of camp, my thoughts on certain situations, that will also lead to record predictions for each team, which also will include the best and worst case scenarios for each team, as well as some SEC teams being such a mystery that it's hard to really even gauge a record prediction at this point, but I will do my best to do such. And this being an Arkansas-related show, plenty of coaches have been interviewed, players as well, after fall camp practices. So the details are out there, and we'll dive into important position battles and what I hope to see in week 1 in Little Rock against Western Carolina. So let's go ahead and get the housekeeping things out of the way. Hawgin the Mic can be heard on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Share the podcast with your fellow Razorback fans or SEC as a whole. I don't discriminate. You can find me personally on Instagram at Brady_Michael. That's Michael. Replace the I with a 1. And no longer Twitter, but on X at bmichael with Michael the same way. And then if you want to read my content that I put out over on fifthquarter.net, you can search that up in the hotbar and follow that up with a /author/I'm_Brady. Let's go ahead and dive into this SEC camp intel, and we'll start in the East, and I'll just go alphabetically. It's easiest to do it that way. So let's start with the Florida Gators. It's Billy Napier's second season down there, and the number one thing that everyone has to be thinking, with Graham Mertz officially being named the starting quarterback, will the contrast of his style with Anthony Richardson, who was their starting quarterback a year ago, 4th overall pick in the draft, you may have heard of him, will he fit Napier's offense better or worse? So Graham Mertz is coming in from Wisconsin last season, had 2,136 yards on a 57% completion clip, and he had a touchdown to interception ratio of 19-10, and that just equated to a 135.0 QBR. A lot of people don't like Graham Mertz. They don't get the hype. He was one of the worst quarterbacks. If you watched him, he had one really good game, the COVID season. He broke out, and then he came back next week, probably got out partying, after a really big win, and he had COVID, and since then it's just been average at best. And Wisconsin's not known for having a great quarterback anyway. Last one, you had Russell Wilson. Another option, you shift over to the defensive side. A name to watch over there is Scooby Williams. He's a redshirt sophomore. He can play any linebacker spot, but they really like him as a pass rusher off the edge the most. Now, he has had some injuries throughout fall camp, but he's been gaining what I'll say is insane momentum by all accounts since April. That goes in the weight room, on the field, all the above. And then going back to Graham Mertz, he's going to have to get some guys that can go out there and really catch the ball to make him look as good as he can. And so can the young wideout room that Florida has really step up? They have Ricky Pearsall. He is back, and he's likely their number one target. But there's tons of battling that's happening behind him. Keep watching sophomore Caleb Douglas. He's a Missouri City, Texas native. Now, he's got the frame and the speed to be a problem on the outside. You also have Zipperer back at tight end, but I like to say he's a glorified receiver at, 6'1", 230 pounds? Something like that. He might not even be 230. And then some other news is that their third-string running back, Carroll, who transferred in from Tulane, I believe 2 years ago, he's a 6-year senior. He may miss some time. I'm not sure what the injury is. But when they have a really good running back room, you can lean on ETN, pretty heavily. I expect him to break out, maybe crack that 1,000-yard mark. They also have Montrell Johnson back, who came over with Napier from Louisiana. That'll just give some options for another freshman to probably step in there. And so looking at their schedule, and I actually don't even have it pulled up yet, but their over-under is currently set, at least whenever I put all this together, at 5.5 wins. And I think, looking at their schedule, let's go ahead and run down that really fast. So they open up the season at Utah. Then they come back home to play McNeese, Tennessee, Charlotte, at Kentucky, versus Vanderbilt, at South Carolina, versus Georgia, versus Arkansas, at LSU, at Mizzou, and then at home against the Fighting Jordan Travises and Florida State. Not the easiest schedule, especially when you start out at Utah in the elevation. I think the best case scenario for them is 8-4. I also think that they have the potential. I want to talk about Graham Mertz some more. If he bombs, and I'm not talking about an 80-yard touchdown bomb, I'm talking about just does not look good at all. We're talking a really bad touchdown-interception ratio like he's been known for. I think they could go 4-8. I think the automatic wins you look over there of those 4 wins I just spoke of, you have McNeese, Charlotte, Vanderbilt, and maybe not even 4. But I don't think they don't win a conference game. So they'll find a way. My prediction is for the Gators to go 6-6 on the season, which includes losses against Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Arkansas, LSU. A lot of big trip down there towards the end of the season. And then Florida State. I'm a big Florida State guy. If I ever get to mention them in a future episode, which I probably will, I really like Jordan Travis. I think what they have going could be a college football playoff team this year. I like their wide receiver room a lot. But who do I not like? The Florida Gators. Shifting to quite the opposite end of the spectrum, you got the Georgia Bulldogs. Can they win 3 straight? Well, coming into this episode, it was like, if Carson Beck isn't the starting quarterback, then who is? Well, Kirby came out and officially has named them the starting quarterback, which is something we've known would happen because Vandegrift, I believe he's a sophomore, redshirt freshman, whatever. He's not quite there yet, but he was the biggest challenger. You also have Stockton, who's a true freshman or redshirt freshman. I don't think Kirby would ever do such a thing, is play a really young quarterback. I mean, we saw Justin Fields leave for that exact same reason. You also have Will Muschamp's son on the roster, I believe. So him not naming a quarterback, which we knew it would be Beck, that's all coach propaganda. It's just a matter of how impactful Beck can be. Can he reach Stetson Bennett numbers? I don't think he can reach those numbers, but I think his impact can be as such. And then they've had a lot of issues at the wide receiver position because they can't identify a true number one. That's quote. They have one of my favorite names in all of college football, Ladd McConkey. He's your leading yard guy from a year ago. And they now have 2 previous SEC stars, SEC leading wide receivers from other teams in their own right, Ra Thomas, Dominique Lovett, and none of the 3 can take the bull by the horns. Now, Dominique Lovett has been stepping up recently after a quiet start, but Ra has been not exactly just taking advantage. Maybe he's a guy that comes on in week 3, 4, 5. However, do you actually need a lead wide receiver when Brock Bowers is there? Because he's the lead guy. I don't care what they say. He's a receiver out there that's just playing the tight end position. But if you need some more depth, they also bring back Rosemy Jack-Saint and Arian Smith, who will be the 4 and 5 at wideout unless they have some true freshmen that step up, which might be the case. And those lead guys are struggling. And there's also doubt that many have in Mike Bobo's offense, which could lead to more than one hiccup on that schedule if they don't get everything organized. Staying on the offensive side of the ball, there's talk that they could also have 6 to 7 offensive linemen that are draft eligible. Well, not draft eligible, but drafted next year. Excuse me. That's a crazy stat. We know Georgia has recruited great offensive linemen, thanks to Sam Pittman mainly. But in recent memory, 6 to 7 guys in one draft would be – there's no words for it, honestly. They also have injury issues at running back, which could become a plague. But it does sound like they could hand me the ball behind that offensive line, and I could average at least 3.7 yards per carry. And then with all that injury talk, they have this true freshman that came in last year by the name of Branson Robinson. His arms are about as wide as your average 18-wheeler. I would give that kid the ball as many times as you want. It doesn't matter with those injuries. I think he's a kid that'll step up at the end of the season regardless as the season progresses. But it's sounding like he might get a little bit more of a shot early on in this season, and that's something I really want to look out for. You also had Kirby say over and over, especially at SEC Media Days, that he's scared of their defensive line not being their standard, up to their standard, despite the fact that they have aliens all over that roster. Even after losing Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, throw them out there. So you look at their schedule, and it's nothing to scoff at, is it? Their over-under is 11.5. Best case scenario for Georgia, clearly 12-0. And their worst case, I don't think they lose more than one game. So the worst case scenario, 11-1. I think they go undefeated despite all the injuries, all the blah at wide receiver that there seems to be. It's not going to be a problem. They might have a little bit of a roadblock versus South Carolina in week 3. But they open with UT Martin, Ball State, who was supposed to be Oklahoma, but the SEC said, no, you can't play that game. Big bummer. And then UAB is after South Carolina. So you open with a stretch that you should go 4-0, and then you go at Auburn, home against Kentucky, at Vandy, at Florida, versus Mizzou, versus Ole Miss, at Tennessee, and at Georgia Tech. Now, Ole Miss's offense could throw up some problems. Devin Leary on Kentucky. Is he as good as advertised? We'll get to that in a second. But that Tennessee game, that's the one absolutely massive toss-up because it's in Knoxville. And that'll all lie on Joe Milton. But I don't think there's any doubts that they can go undefeated once again, especially with that non-conference. You get to get all those young guys as much experience as you can because you'll be up 55-0 at halftime in at least 2 of those games. I like UAB. I think they have a chance to, keep it 49 points before half. Who knows? Let's move to Kentucky and let's talk Devin Leary for a second. So if you're unfamiliar on the guy, the dude that will be their QB1 officially, well, that's what we're here for. That's what I'm here for. So he comes over from NC State after what was a season-ending injury in 2022. But he was one of the best quarterbacks during the 2021 season and was viewed as a potential day 2 and maybe even slipping up into round 1 of the NFL draft. So that 2021 year, he threw for 3,433 yards on a 65.7% completion percentage, and he had 35 touchdowns to 5 picks. Looks a lot better than Graham Mertz, doesn't it? And a 147 QBR. Now, he's not a big runner, but I believe, and I don't think this is a heavy sentiment here, that he can be better than Will Levis. I didn't like Will Levis, and I didn't understand the hype. If you listen to the episode that ended, episode 10, back in April, I was doing the mock draft. I didn't like Levis. I didn't think he should have been a first-round pick, but I threw him up there anyway. So who is Leary going to be throwing to? Well, they have a lot of returning players offensively, and I target that wide receiver room for 2 guys in particular. You have Dane Key, who's coming off a stellar freshman year, and then you have Barry and Brown. Both of them are super young. They're threats all over the field. You throw them in the slot, outside. They combined for over 1,100 receiving yards last year, and their offensive line isn't as questionable as last season, but they did lose a 5-star Kiwanta Goodwin, which I don't really know how much that hurts. I don't know if he was going to be considered a starter or was even in the running, but he was a freak out of high school, so I would imagine he had a pretty good shot. And I don't remember where he transferred to, but he's already put himself back in the portal, so some stuff going on there. Shifting over the defensive side, when I think Kentucky football, at least in recent memory, because before that they didn't have anything, I think defense, and all things are pointing to at least some improvement, especially in the secondary. You have Andrew Phillips having their CB1, cornerback 1, under wraps, as it sounds. You also have Jalen Geiger, who's back at free safety after injuries. and he probably takes that job. Their defensive coordinator, Brad White, did mention how the offense has stretched the field all fall and beat them a lot, which is, I think, credit to how good their offense can be. And speaking of that offense again, you have Ray Davis. I mentioned him as one of my breakout players. It should be as no surprise. He's a known commodity. With no more Chris Rodriguez, he's off to the NFL. He comes over from Vanderbilt. They like what they see out of him. Big power, hard runner. But watch, there's another NC State transfer to know. And his name is something that I need to know myself. It's Dimi Sumo Kangbe. And it sounds like they've unlocked a new gear in that young running back. He had almost 400 yards as a true freshman last year behind Zonovan Knight, who's also off to the NFL for the Wolfpack. But you look at their schedule, and I have flip-flopped with how much good news has been coming out of Devin Leary. Their over-under is at 6.5. I look at the schedule, and we'll go down that first before I even speak on the records. Sorry about the Georgia. But they also play Ball State, so go Ball State. You have back-to-back SEC games to open. Maybe they'll survive and be able to actually play some MAC games, especially MACtion. You can't miss out on that. But home against Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, Akron, and then you go to Vanderbilt, and then versus Florida. That's a pretty easy start. But then guess what happens after that? You go to Georgia, home against Mizzou, home against Tennessee, at Mississippi State versus Bama, who they drew from the West this year, go them. And then they get at South Carolina, at Louisville to finish off the season. I think the best case scenario, you win 9 games. I've tried to lean 10 if everything's as good as it seems, with Georgia and Bama being those 2 losses. But Tennessee looms in there. So I like 9-3. I think the worst case is bowl eligibility, 6-6. And then I lean on my prediction. I started out at 7-5, but I want to up it to 8-4 with losses at Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and then I believe at Mississippi State or out South Carolina might bite them at the end of the year. That Louisville game ain't gonna be so easy either with their new head coach. All they need is a good quarterback up there. But let's shift to Elijah Drankwitz, the power nerd. And, of course, they're recently in the news for a different reason, and one that makes me feel great disdain within, that I even have to talk about it. But Williams Nwaneri, top 10 prospect in the 2024 class, number 1 edge on a couple services, 247 Sports is one of them. He committed to Missouri, I believe, like a week ago to this point. And they're also in the running for Ryan Wingo, one of the top 2 receivers in the 24 class. They have this new document that was signed for the Missouri government that if you commit to an in-state college in the state of Missouri, then you can start receiving NIL funds while you're still in high school. How much of a factor is that? I have no idea. But looking at Camp Intel, Missouri ranks 9th in FBS with 78% of their roster production returning, which includes quarterback Brady Cook. And for QB1, it's going to be his job to lose. Now, hating on a dude named Brady sounds ironic, but I don't think he's the most talented guy. You also have Jake Garcia, who transferred in from Miami, and I believe he has the most ability. And then you also have Sam Horn, big baseball guy. He's also a pitcher, and he did play last season for Missouri, and he's a very solid pitcher as well. But could he actually end up balancing 2 sports, or is he going to pull what Connor Nolan did and just focus on baseball? Which, I mean, it's a lose-lose situation if you ask me at Missouri. But either way, none of them have seemingly been reliable in camp. There's been a drill where they're supposed to avoid pressure and then try to hit a net. They have, like, you go to a Dave & Buster's and you got to hit those targets with the football, which I suck at doing anyway, so what good is it me to critique this? But they're coming off getting hit or that pressure, and they're not even hitting the net at all. They're just completely missing the net, apparently. So if that's a sign of things to come, well, they better be able to run the ball. And Drankwitz believes that they have the deepest offensive line room since he's been there and has the most battles because of such. You have Javon Foster. He's locked at left tackle, and the rest is seemingly up for grabs. I would be shocked if Cameron Johnson doesn't start on that right side at right tackle. Big-time transfer from Houston. He was a first-team All-AAC, American Athletic Conference selection in 2022, and he allowed just 1 sack and over 500 snaps. Really impressive, but is he SEC ready? That's a question to be seen, but I bet he starts out at right tackle. I'm also particularly curious on how Theo Weiss fits in at wide receiver, comes over from OU. You have Luther Burden, who's back, and without a doubt, wide receiver 1 as it stands. And they also have Mookie Cooper, who's a former stud from Ohio State that needs to be unlocked. And if you get those 3 at their top potential, I really don't care who starts at quarterback. You just need them to be somewhat average, and they'll have an offense that can go. To an extent. A big what if is what happens when Luther Burden doesn't get the catches and yards he expects. Now, he's a future NFL guy. There's no doubts there. But it's year 2 for him. Would that lead to him transferring out and the whole in-state NIL thing blow up in their face? It'd be an interesting thing because I believe Luther Burden, if it happens, he's going to look to those bigger schools, look for the returning quarterback, look for the big-time pass offense. And that would lead me to think someone like Lane Kiffin might go try to get him. But leaning over to the defensive side, they have some goons on that defensive side at each position group. So their defensive potential is pretty high. They have Tyron Hopper at linebacker. He's that primary guy that'll lead their team in tackles and the team as a whole. And I believe that the secondary has plenty of returnees that can be effective. You look at Rakestraw and Abrams Drain at corner. Abrams Drain, a former receiver, Rakestraw, low-rated recruit, but he had offers out to Wazoo, and both of them have turned into pretty good players. You look at their schedule, and their over-under sits at 6.5 right now. And let's go down it real quick. They open against South Dakota at home versus Middle Tennessee versus Kansas State and versus Memphis. 4 straight home games to open. Actually, that Memphis game is neutral site. I think it's in St. Louis, if I'm not mistaken. Then you go to Vandy versus LSU, at Kentucky versus South Carolina, at Georgia versus Tennessee versus Florida, and at Arkansas. I think the best case scenario, you get good enough quarterback play and that defense shows what it needs to. You can get to 8-4, but their worst case scenario, flip it. Yeah, either way, 4-8. But my prediction for them is to go 5-7. I don't believe all the hype. And here's the thing, I think they could start out 4-0 in that South Dakota, Middle Tennessee, Kansas State, and Memphis stretch and still finish with 5 wins. Vanderbilt's a trap game. I'm in on the Clark Lee hype, and I think they might lose that game, and I would predict it today. Now, Kansas State, also not an easy win. They went down and got obliterated in Manhattan, Kansas last year. There's just not a lot of favorable games on the schedule. I look at that Florida game at home at the end of the year. Is Florida going to be in a condition where they want to travel to Missouri in the middle of November and play a game that'll probably be in the 20s as far as temperature goes, 30s if they're lucky? Unless it's just, a classic curveball and it's a 60-degree sunny day. You never know, but can they get up for that? I'm not in. I'm not in on the Drankwitz hype this year. He's barely been able to get them to bowl games the past 2 years. Can he do it again? If he does, it'll be by the hair of his chin. Moving down to South Carolina, 5-star freshman Nick Harbor is apparently not quite ready, and that's despite him being my favorite to break out at wide receiver. Now you think, wide receiver, okay, how big is he? Well, he's up to 240 pounds at 6'5", and he also has, quote, Olympic speed. And go watch his film. I mean, you can see it on, it'll take 2 plays. So you look, the big story for South Carolina is what will Dow Loggins, Arkansas's former tight end coach, what will his offense look like as their new OC? Now, the play of Spencer Rattler will obviously determine a lot of that, which also leads me to wonder how well he can develop Rattler. There's been talk every year about him finally unlocking his potential, and guess what? It's back again, much like the unwanted holiday postcard from that one family member, or family. You also, speaking of Rattler, he's got a target, Juice Wells. He's had some injury concerns during camp and has missed some practice time, but he's expected to miss all of this week, and he's coming in as their number 1 wide receiver, and there's no question surrounding that. The rest of the room is mostly unproven, and that's a big reason to why, despite him turning down the draft to come back another year. You look at tight end as well. Trey Knox went over there with Dow Loggins. He's not going to be their only option to catch the football in the tight end room. You got Josh, Jimmy, Simon, whatever you want to call him, out of Western Kentucky. He's turned some heads recently, and so that might lead Dow to more 2 tight end sets, 12 personnel we like to call it, for his pro-style offense. That might build a little bit more excitement because it doesn't seem like there's a ton as is. You also have on that offensive side the role of Dakereon Joyner, and it's a fun story. Former quarterback, came in as a QB, turned into a wide receiver after the first year, and now he's been turned into a running back. So it's a confusing path. All he's missing is the offensive line and tight end to complete, what would it be, like the cycle in baseball? A single, double, triple, home run? Well, you cover every spot. Well, he's a guy that they clearly want on the field. And I would imagine they'll scheme up some plays for him to take direct snaps at running back, or you throw him a pass out as a wide receiver and let him air it out down the field. The thing is, he's perfectly capable to play both of those 2 spots, so it's not even a guarantee that he throws the ball every time he's out there, because it sounds like he's going to start at running back as a secret weapon. Imagine if we had that capability with Hornsby. Difference is Dakereon's a way bigger guy than Hornsby ever was. So that's a fun thing to watch over there. And they've also had some injury concerns at running back, which you need Dakereon to stay healthy. Leaning over to the defensive side, the secondary doesn't have many questions with Dial and O'Fortune coming back to play corner. Their defensive line and linebacker spots may be a spot for curiosity and maybe worry as the season goes along, especially with Georgia on the schedule as early as usual. There's going to be a lot of youth playing on that defensive line, with the one old man on that side being Tonka Hemingway, another great name in the SEC. Lots of growing pains will likely take place on that defense, and it's had many great moments in recent memory. There will likely be some regression. They've lost too many good players to the portal that, well, just won't. It'll pay somewhere. And you look on that offensive side, Jaheim Bell, Marshawn Lloyd, gone. Defensive side, they lost, Jordan Birch, I believe. So you look at their schedule. They're sitting at an over-under of 6 on the money. They open up against North Carolina in Charlotte. Then they play home against Furman, at Georgia versus Mississippi State, at Tennessee versus Florida, at Missouri, at A&M versus Jacksonville State, new D1 team. Well, not new D1 team, new FBS team, versus Vandy, versus Kentucky, and versus Clemson. 4 straight homers to end the season. Best case scenario, you get all the really good play, all the hype from Spencer Rattler. Dow Loggins' offense doesn't suck. The defensive young guys step up. The old guys stand their ground. They can go 9-3. But worst case, you reverse any of that, they go 5-7. And it's tough to make this prediction because they've always hit the over since their head coach has been there, because the name's gone Shane Beamer. But I think this year I'm just gonna push. I think they win 6 games. I wish it was set at 6.5 because I would go under. I think you look at their schedule: the Georgia, Tennessee, A&M, Clemson games, maybe even Kentucky, are definite losses and toss-ups against Missouri, Florida, North Carolina. It's not very favorable, especially with how little confidence I have in Rattler. So I'll just avoid it. Move down to Tennessee. There seems to be nothing world-breaking happening over there on that offensive side of the ball. You have Joe Milton. He's supposedly been incredibly decisive and accurate all camp. And Josh Heupel said he may not even have thrown a pick to this point, at least in scrimmages. And that last part is absolutely massive because you look back to last year, Hendon Hooker didn't have an incredible arm on him, but he was so incredibly accurate. And you win with accuracy. You saw that at Alabama in the COVID season with Mac Jones. So lots of good things there, as expected, but we'll see how Joe Milton steps into the spotlight. Can he handle that pressure? They still have Small at running back, who can do it all. Call me Dr. Seuss. He still needs to improve his pass pro, if I had to pick on anything. You also have Brew McCoy at wide receiver, and he's done as expected as a pretty big physical guy, really physical receiver, might even be the most physical in the SEC. And it's just a matter of who steps up behind him or beside him. And I say beside because it sounded like Dante Thornton has that Jalen Hyatt speed, but he's 6'4" as opposed to 6'1", which is freaky stuff. If Squirrel White ends up getting plugged into the starting slot, that's your most likely starting 3 as it stands, and he might be another breakout guy. Their defense has areas of super experience, and it starts with a couple transfers, and they've had nothing but good things said about them. You look at Keenan Peely, former BYU Cougar. He has that BYU seniority, and there's no way that he's not a starter at inside linebacker or at one of the outside spots in general. He flies to the football. He knows how to command a defense, and that's what they're going to ask him to do. They also have Gabe Judy Lally at corner, who used to play at Vanderbilt, I believe, and he comes over from BYU as well. He will start at corner at the 1 or 2 and dominate as a press guy because he's a massive corner, 6'3", just above 210 off the top of my head. He's also has been a role model for their 3 up-and-coming freshman corners, which will likely have to play some ball for depth reasons alone, and that's a pretty scary thing to say, playing freshman secondary guys in the SEC. Along all that youth on the defensive side is a linebacker to watch, and his name is Arion Carter. He's a true freshman that's been coming on super strong since he's arrived in Knoxville. Super, super speedy as an outside linebacker that could play some edge and win just on speed alone. I don't know if he'll start to begin the season, but I would not be surprised based on everything that's been said if he isn't ready to start by October. They need that youth to step up and build needed depth there, or the under that we're about to talk about might start to look a little bit more enticing. And that over-under is set at 9.5. Look at the schedule. They start against Virginia in Nashville, and then they host Austin Peay at Florida versus UT San Antonio versus South Carolina versus A&M, at Bama, at Kentucky versus UConn, go Huskies, at Missouri versus Georgia, and versus Vanderbilt. If they get every ounce of play out of Joe Milton to replenish what is lost by Hooker and that cast of characters, they can go 12-0. Now, that defense might be problematic, and to some extent, like I said, a lot of youth there. But if you get it some average play there, 12-0's in the cards. I think 9-3 is their worst. Now, I could go lower than that, but I have a lot of confidence in that offense to at least produce enough to win 9 games. And I predict them to go back and forth, but gosh, 11-1 is hard to avoid, and that Georgia game is my one loss. They could have a choke in there. At Alabama's obviously not a gimme. At Kentucky could also be a spot where they trip, and then you're at the under. And they also have to play A&M. So it's a tough one there. I wouldn't want to touch it just because of how many mysteries there are on that defensive side of the ball. Last team in the East, you got the Vanderbilt Commodores. Now, they lost Ray Davis to Kentucky, as mentioned, so that running back position is one of concern to this point. And at wide receiver, they still have Will Shepard as the wide receiver 1, and the quarterback sounds like it'll be year 2 of the A.J. Swan experience. Now, the lack of talent in that running back room is one thing, and it's bad by SEC standards, but it's just bad in general terms. Now, listening to interviews with players, including Swan after some practices in fall camp, no one wants to ask about the running back room, not a soul, and I think that's a bad sign. I really do. Now, there has been lots of good things surrounding their experienced offensive line who's returning a group of 5 guys that is combined for nearly 40 starts last season, and A.J. Swan, the quarterback, has full confidence. He has confidence too, yeah, in the guys that can hopefully match up with SEC caliber defensive lines. Health of their secondary may be the difference in competing for a bowl game, in my opinion. During their first scrimmage, the defense ended up lacking starting safeties DeRicky Wright and Jalen Mahoney, which resulted in the offense just running the defense off the field. Their return to the second scrimmage was the first thing that Clark Lee ended up jumping on, basically giving an I told you so appeal since the offense was quite limited in their success on that second time around. And then you also have Ethan Barr at inside linebacker, who came back. I think he'll lead the team in tackles. They always have a linebacker up there that does. And that's a safe bet, much like the line that's on their Week 0 game at Hawaii. We'll get to that at the end of the show. You look at their schedule. They're over-under set at 3.5. And they start against Hawaii versus Alabama A&M, at Wake, at UNLV, versus Kentucky, versus Missouri, at Florida, versus Georgia, at Ole Miss, versus Auburn, and then ends the season at South Carolina and at Tennessee. Best case scenario for the Commodores is something they haven't seen in some time, and that's a 6-6 bowl game appeal. But worst case scenario, it's what you've been getting out of Vanderbilt, 3-9, which could be worse. My prediction for them is to go 5-7 on the year with a 4-0 start, 5-1 with a loss to Kentucky. But that end of the schedule, when you look past Missouri, is just a gauntlet for a team such as Vanderbilt, especially if they can't find a running back. That's too much pressure on a really young and not all the way proven quarterback. Let's go ahead and switch over to the SEC West now, and we'll start with Alabama. And I bet you thought I'd start with the quarterback nightmare that they have happening down there, but I'm going to refuse to talk about that for now. Who is that quarterback one going to even throw the football to? Because it sounds like the wide receiver room is just as big an issue at finding the number one guy. Only two that come to mind are Jermaine Burton and Ja'Cory Brooks. And when those guys are your premier pass catchers on paper, it presents chaos, does it not? Especially when you look at, you can identify an absolute stud on their roster in the past, and you normally have two of them. Now, behind them, you got Shaz Preston. He has unreal speed. He's a redshirt freshman out there. Do you also have Bond, who's another young guy? Law, do they step up? So lots of youth that doesn't really reflect the typical Bama five-star corner killers like the history books have told us about anyway. So is there help at the tight end position? We have C.J. Dupree from Maryland, and it sounds like he's the guy there, but I couldn't name another one on the roster off the top of my head if I had to. So you look at the scrimmages, they've taught everyone that Tommy Rees, the new offensive coordinator, loves running the ball, and boy should he, because there's plenty of known commodities there, not to mention it may be the best offensive line that Bama's seen in some time. You have Caden Proctor, true freshman, that they stole away from Iowa. He's going to start at left tackle for him right off the bat. You also have a lot of young guys across the line proving that they got some chops, and they're beating out some of the experienced dudes, which sounds bad. It's like, oh, you got this redshirt freshman in here beating up on a graduate senior. What's going on? Well, they're just playing better. It's really not the case of a drop-off. So I think that's a great situation for them. You have lots of room for Jace McClellan, Roydell Williams, and then your two true freshmen you brought in to run. It would be worthless if whoever they name the starting quarterback can't throw the ball into the ocean if he was standing in front of it, because then everyone knows you're just going to run the ball and run the ball and run the ball. But defense, it sounds a lot like that of past Bama teams. Otherwise, they'd be in a world of trouble. Now, the only issue has been inconsistencies along their interior defensive line outside of Jaheim Otis, who's going to start there. If you know football, you know the names. The game plan destroyers that they have on that backside, especially like Kool-Aid McKinstry is the first one that comes to mind, Dallas Turner. Watch Caleb Downs at safety now. All the signs are pointing to him being an instant factor as a true freshman, despite Nick Saban not wanting to spill the beans on him. He just wants to give him all the compliments and say, yeah, he's still got a lot to learn. Well, he's getting some incredible hype, and I would be shocked if he doesn't start. So back to that quarterback situation. Can't avoid it. Who's the best quarterback for the job? You have Jalen Milroe, Ty Simpson, and Buckner. Now, everyone wanted to say at the beginning of camp that Buckner's that lead guy because he'll know Tommy Rees's offense. Well, newsflash, Tommy Rees is just going to be calling Nick Saban's offense. So Buckner is just going to know the terminology, and that's as far as it goes. He's going to have more to learn, in my eyes, or did to this point, as install's likely done as it is for Arkansas and a lot of other teams. I think in an offense that you're going to be run heavy, Jalen Milroe's going to start. I'm on the Ty Simpson train, but I still think that he will based on just how big of a tank he is. He ran straight through some of Arkansas's defense is a game that I'd like to forget. But Ty Simpson, I mean, he's got the youth, too. The lack of SEC experience certainly hurts. He's got better arm talent by a mile. Jalen Milroe still needs to improve on a lot. Can he at least get his arm to average? If he does, then you might be looking at another national championship team for Alabama just because of how good that defense is. Their over-unders, 10.5. Look at their schedule. They start off against Middle Tennessee State, Texas, at South Florida, Ole Miss, at Mississippi State, at A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, LSU, at Kentucky versus the University of Chattanooga, and then at Auburn for the Iron Bowl. Best case scenario for Bama, clearly 12-0. Everything goes right. Defense shows up as it does. Your quarterback's at least average. Your wide receivers become less of a question, or you're just leaning so heavily on the run game that the defense is just shutting everything down. You start averaging 17 a game, but your defense is only giving up 10. You know, the old Bama teams. Worst case scenario is 9-3, and there'd be a lot of questions around Nick Saban if that happens. But my prediction is for Alabama to take 2 losses, and I think back-to-back. That Tennessee LSU back-to-back there, and then at Kentucky. Actually, that's out of that 3-game stretch. You could lose 2 of those. But if your defense does show up, as expected, you might be able to wipe those away. But I'll take the under at 10 wins there. Now, Arkansas, the reason why some of you, or the majority of you, are here. Now, what's seemingly been the story of Arkansas's camp is the impact that this defensive line could have through 2 scrimmages. You have 9 players along that front that are base seniors or older, grad senior, COVID senior, senior. Now, despite Pittman being proud of the performance of certain offensive linemen in the first scrimmage and then some talk in the second, apparently the defensive line took them to the woodshed both times and caused issues for the QBs, KJ, and all. So what's that depth like? You know, thinking the starters on the edge will be Jeff Coat. I mean, that's an obvious one. He's had the most positive things said about him. And then Landon Jackson's just the quiet worker at 6'7", 280 now. And then you look at that interior, it looks more like a dice roll. Go play some bets on it or something somewhere. Bet Saracen, they got that up yet? As the starting defensive tackles, there's no telling. You have Tank Booker, Torian Carter, Cam Ball, Kevy Rose. All of those are capable SEC guys. And I think Tank Booker, Torian Carter, if he can prove that he's back and healthy and stronger, and then Cam Ball, I think all those guys can be NFL players. So we would hope they're at least SEC dudes, right? That's the minimum. You also have the transfer wideouts. You need them to be impactful, and they all certainly have. You look at Andrew Armstrong. He's been the talk of the camp offensively. He's been causing plenty of issues for the entire secondary, even the best guys. Except for Nudie, I don't think he's matched up with him as much as you look at Snacks primarily. And with how well he's been performing, it feels like TSLA is being taken for granted internally and obviously nationally. And that's actually a good thing. Sure, keep him a secret. Let us know about him. We'll let other teams figure it out. As he can squat over 400 pounds, bench over 300, listed on like the 247 Sports All Freaks list. He's a monster. And then you also have Isaiah Satania, who's probably right there behind Armstrong in terms of notability as camp improvement. He's only getting better, and he's apparently built different from last season physically and has been more aggressive and more crisp in routes. He's going to be the lead screen catcher, I'd have to imagine, and lead receiver on verts with his speed, so talk about diversity. And then you also have Sam Bakke, who's been on a tear up until his injury, which that was a poor choice of words considering what we all think it is when you talk about a knee injury that'll keep you out for an entire season. He's a really unspoken guy at 6'3", 200 pounds and a little bit of change there on those last 2 points. But he was just quietly ripping off 50-yard throws over the top, 50-yard catches over the top, over some of the best on that Arkansas side, and now he's gone. He was going to be more of a secret than TSLA when you really think about it. And so we'll have to see how that recovery goes, how much of an impact can he make when he comes back. Next season, he was going to be a guy that was probably 4 or 5 on that roster at the wide receiver spot, at least by the end of the season. So it's not the biggest blow on the team, but it's definitely one that hurts. And then you have the offensive line. They're still shuffling around, at least as tackles stand. You have Bo Limmer. He's a definite starter at center. Latham and Braun both have the guard spots on lockdown. So who's been jumping off the page on the outside? And that first name is Devin Manuel. He's a guy that was near 400, if not 400 pounds last year, and he's since reformed his body, and he sits in about the 320 range. And he looks better, he moves better, and it sounds like that left tackle spot is his to lose at this point. Now, Andrew Chamblee's been challenging, but I don't think he starts. You also have Patrick Kudus as a run blocker. He's been compared to that of a road grader, and he needs to develop his pass blocking. But it does sound like he's on his way and might get the start as another really young tackle, which you got that veteran interior. They can help get those guys prepared. We got the schedule early on to at least get them ready for SEC play. You also bring in Amari Wiggins from the JUCO ranks, and that has allowed the move for Kudus out to right tackle from backup center, and he's taken full advantage of it. As I said, Andrew Chamblee may have a word alongside Tykeus Crawford, which that might be a battle for the, quote, sixth man of the offensive line, first man off the bench that can shift out to tackle. I don't know if Chamblee'd play guard just based on his size, but Tykeus Crawford is a guy that they're not scared to play at right guard, right tackle, left guard. I don't think left tackle. I don't think I trust his foot speed to play out there. But you look at Arkansas' schedule. They got an over-under of 7 and start out against Western Carolina, Kent State, BYU, at LSU, A&M in Arlington, at Ole Miss, at Alabama, the worst stretch of that schedule and probably in the country. Mississippi State at home, at Florida, Auburn, FIU, and then Missouri to wrap up the season. Best case scenario for Arkansas is 10-2. Now, you have a lot of people predicting that. I don't know if I want to stretch that far yet, because if you can come out of that stretch, and I've heard Trey Biddy and the like, a lot of media heads are out there saying, if you can come out of that LSU, A&M, Ole Miss, Alabama stretch 2-2, there's a great chance you'll finish 2-2, or you'll finish 10-2. But how beat up are you when you come out of that stretch? Do you come back home and Mississippi State clip you, or Auburn and Hugh Freeze come in and do what Hugh Freeze does? That's a scary spot. And I'm not saying BYU can't beat us either. Kalani Sitake wants revenge. Worst case scenario for Arkansas, and if it reaches this point, then we might have an issue, is 6-6. And that's if injuries become an issue in that 4-game stretch. And then the team might just be kaput by the end of the season. But I don't think it happens. I have Arkansas going 9-3, 8-4 is pulling at me, but 9-3 is my prediction there, with losses to LSU, Ole Miss, and Alabama, which 1-3 in that stretch. You come out healthy, you're looking good. Move down to Auburn. Hugh Freeze just spoke of him. So the word's out there that Freeze has taken some average quarterbacks in overtime, and he's turned them into that silver, maybe not quite gold standard guy. Now, could he do that with Peyton Thorne, the Michigan State transfer? Now, I thought Robbie Ashford was the guy that would break out under Freeze based on his speed, his quarterback whisper ability, mobility, everything. My prediction looks to be headed full speed straight for the guardrail and off a cliff, because Peyton Thorne, while being up and down, has been performing good and subtly been named the starting quarterback. I think maybe it has been made official. I'm not sure. I just saw that it's been out there, but he's going to be the guy. Now, the portal class that they brought in, it seems to be all hits out there. You're looking at targets for Thorne. You have the tight end from FIU, Fairweather. He's going to start down there, and he could be a monster if they get him the ball. The same could be said for Jair Shorter from North Texas. You got Hooks from Jackson State. He's gotten a lot of targets in camp and in scrimmages. But the world of Shorter being named their lead receiver, in my eyes, is way more likely, despite lacking the targets in comparison. Now, their offensive line is sprinkled with a lot of transfer starters as well. So that's something of note. You look at the transfer from Tulsa that Arkansas was in on. He's looking to be a starter at guard, I do believe. Maybe even right tackle. Now, there's not a ton of news on the defensive side of the ball, but Elijah McAllister has been a force in the backfield, particularly with the pass rush. They also have that tank from Oregon in his second year, Jason Jones, 6'6", and a lot of pounds. Kentucky transfer Justin Rogers, another big defensive tackle in there. So they're set on that interior, at least as the starters go. Now, they did lose plenty of talent in the secondary, but you have DJ James, who may be the primary factor for them on the outside. And looking down their schedule, their over-under sits at 6.5. They open against UMass, trip over to Cal Berkeley versus Samford at A&M, Georgia at LSU versus Ole Miss, Mississippi State, at Vandy, at Arkansas, New Mexico State, and Bama to end the season. Best case scenario for them, Peyton Thorne does just a good enough job. Jarquez Hunter comes back from injury and takes another step forward. They can go 8-4. That worst case scenario is all those transfers don't quite mesh, and maybe Hugh Freeze just needs to let some of those guys develop, and they go 5-7. I have them going 7-5 with losses to Georgia, LSU, and Ole Miss, which is just straight up 3 in a row there, and I think injuries could end up being a problem there. I don't like to predict injuries. But then you have the Bama game, which Hugh Freeze is known to just pull off some wacky ones there. So, and then Arkansas, I have that as a loss as well. Moving down to LSU. Now, word is that the staff isn't just confident, but overly confident in Malik Neighbors taking the next step at wide receiver. He had over 1,000 yards on 72 catches last year, and he's been standing out in red zone work, and his connection with Jaden Daniels has been growing. You also have Alabama transfer Aaron Anderson. He's going to be their slot guy, and they like his skill set a lot. And then they have a pimp at tight end by the name of Kamorian Pimpton, and apparently he's way more athletic than what they thought, and he's probably their number one highlight reel guy, which is weird as a tight end, but I would say that's probably Brock Bowers for Georgia. On that defensive side, you have Denver Harris, who's brought all the drama over with him from A&M. If you remember how he ended up over there, it happened because he was filming an Instagram Live while he was speeding in his car through a parking garage. He's got, if that doesn't tell you personality issues, well, he put them on display. Sounds like a locker room cancer. He also got into a fight with another LSU player. And because of all that, he's been missing practices, and he was not featured in the team photo. Take that as you will. Now, they have Deuce Chestnut, Syracuse transfer, and Zay Alexander in their corner, who's been impressing as both of them are transfers. But they aren't the athlete that Harris is, so that'll have a little bit of a sting to it. And maybe that move has had Sage Ryan play a little bit more safety, move down from safety to play some more corner. And just some cross-training is what it could be, as Sam Pittman puts it. And then you look at the offensive and defensive lines. They seem to be set with a little camp to go. The same goes for the linebackers, and let me tell you, that linebacker room may end up being the best in the SEC. You have Harold Perkins. I don't need to introduce him. But you also have Omar Spates, Oregon State transfer. He's going to be the inside linebacker. He has directed that Beaver defense for 4 years straight, and he's coming in absolute mammoth in the middle. High football IQ, very vocal. I don't know if he's going to beat Harold Perkins for tackles, but if he's not going to finish below second, I'll tell you that much. Then you have Greg Penn. He's a big edge outside linebacker that they might slide down to defensive end on certain plays. Same goes for Perkins. Then you have the health of Mason Smith. That's still not completely settled. If you remember, last year he suffered that season-ending injury against Florida State, but he suffered a minor injury last week. He's the type of talent that could be the difference in a close game. That's how impressive he really is. Look at their schedule. They have an over-under of 9.5. And I think, well, let me read it off first. They start off at Florida State and Orlando, versus Grambling, at Mississippi State, Arkansas, at Ole Miss, at Missouri, Auburn, Army, the really oddball one in there, at Alabama, Florida, Georgia State, and A&M. Best case scenario, Jane Daniels is the best quarterback in the SEC. You have some really good running back talent. Logan Diggs transferred in there from ND, Notre Dame. Malik Neighbors breaks onto the scene. Your offensive line does a good enough job, and then that defense is just running around with their hair on fire. They could go 12-0. They could win the SEC West 12-0 record. But worst case scenario, some things don't quite go their way. Jaden Daniels doesn't improve, as a thrower. They go 8-4, but my prediction is for them to go 10-2. Florida State to begin the year, I chalk it up as a loss, and then they have one more trip-up game in there, and I think you could just throw it anywhere. Alabama, A&M, at Ole Miss, I think any of those can be a loss. I'm not ready to say Arkansas could be that one. Maybe Mississippi State to start the year. Zach Arnett comes out, surprises some folks. We'll see how that goes. Speaking of the state of Mississippi, we'll shift down to Lane Kiffin. And it's all going to start with the transfers for the Rebels, so much so that the guys taking the most reps at starting spots on defense are primarily transfers. In their most recent scrimmage that they had, 8 of their starters were players that transferred into Oxford. Now, on that defensive line, you have old man Isaac Ukwu. He is, I believe, in his 8th year, transfer from James Madison. And then you have J.J. Pegues. They've both been impressing along that defensive line. You throw Monty Williams in there at linebacker for good measure as another guy that's shown good signs. He's going to play middle probably, but I wouldn't be shocked if they have some formations where he's on the outside. And then on the offensive side, it's none other than Caden Priestcorn, tight end from Memphis. Now, when he comes in, and all of a sudden Michael Trigg, who was their starting tight end last year, who had a solid year, is running with the twos, that is going to speak huge amounts to the positives around Caden, that he might even be an all-SEC guy. I like him a lot as well. They also brought in 2 wide receivers that I really like. You have Trey Harris from Louisiana Tech, 6'3", 215, big body jump ball receiver that can get vertical. He can go underneath. He's just a scary outside target, but I don't even think he's going to lead them in receiving yards because their last addition from the portal was Zachary Franklin from UTSA, who has been injured and might end up being out the rest of camp. So that's going to hurt. He'll have to work his way in, but I think once he's there, you can plug him at the slot. He'll start outside. If you watched him at UT San Antonio, he was their lead guy, I believe, 2 years in a row. Absolute stud and future NFL guy. Both of them have that potential. You also have freshman wideout Aiden Williams. He may be that third guy to work in there. Big-time recruit for Kiffin in the 2023 cycle. He's got a big frame. He's a little lanky, but he has enough control and speed to be an issue and a jump ball type player. Now, speaking of freshmen, they also have an animal on that defensive side, and I've spoke on him before on the show. Former 5-star linebacker Suntarine Perkins, who will start. He at least should. I don't know how he won't. He looks like your typical Bama or Georgia freshman, but he made his way over to Ole Miss instead, so keep an eye on him to make more of an impact as the season progresses. Number 1 inside linebacker, according to 247 Sports in his class. And it seems as if all the quarterback talent, I put obvious air quotes on that they brought in was all for naught, as Jackson Dart has been called everything but the official starter. You look on their social media, it's all Jackson Dart related. They'll show, yada, 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 dart emoji, dartboard emoji from their Ole Miss X account, not Twitter account. Oh. And so with the play style of Spencer Sanders, I was one to stand in his corner for that Kiffin offense, thinking he would win over the job, and yet I forgot one key aspect of his game, is that he can't throw the damn football. If you watch the Kansas State game last year, that's all you need to see. It was, 49-56 to nothing? You also have Walker Howard. He came in there from LSU. He's still young. He ain't quite there yet, but he's the future there, at least, assuming he develops as expected, near 5-star recruit in the past. I think their offense has a chance to be incredible, and word from coaches is just the same. They just need to see how improved Dart really is. If he can become a touch more decisive, then it'll lie on their defense to get them somewhere. And you look at their schedule, and their over-under sits at 7.5. They open against Mercer, at Tulane, Georgia Tech, at Bama, versus LSU, back-to-back. I believe they're the only SEC team that has that feat, so go Lane Kiffin. Arkansas, at Auburn, Vanderbilt, A&M, at Georgia, ULM. Everybody wants ULM on their schedule. Ole Miss got lucky. And at Mississippi State to end the year. I think their best case scenario is 10-2. Offense comes out there, does what's expected. The defense meshes with all the transfers they have. Worst case scenario, I had it at 7-5, but I've dropped it to 6-6. And I'll tell you what, The reason I say that is, what if all the transfers all of a sudden turn on Kiffin? So was Kiffin shopping the coach market last season because he was worried about this team? Now, topics like that might just be stuff to get the focus off of the talent, and he's trying to keep everyone from keeping their eyes on Jackson Dart and that offense that has Quishon Judkins. I mean, you can't not talk about Ole Miss and mention the guy, leading running back in the SEC with Rocket right behind him. I'm going to take a sip real quick. The voice is starting to slip. Don't mind me. We're not trying to be professional here. But with the end of the season stretch there, they could easily just start knocking the games down, especially with A&M, Georgia, Mississippi State. Is Mississippi State in full form at that point of the year? Does Vanderbilt clip them? There's no telling. I actually put out a poll on my X account and said, which team is more likely to basically fall apart at the first sign of danger? And it was A&M or Ole Miss. And I wanted to vote for Ole Miss. I think it might be more likely just because they have so many more transfers versus young talent that are still out there trying to prove themselves. You get a bunch of transfers in there, and they just don't work, and then your coach was out there shopping for that Auburn job, you can just all blow up in his face, especially if they have some issues after that Alabama-LSU stretch. They come into Fayetteville and lose, or they host Arkansas and lose. Trouble. So, Mississippi State now. I've talked about him too many times to not get to him. New coach Zach Arnett. What offense does he want to run? Well, sounds and looks like it'll be some variation of a stretch, power run, pro-style offense, but how much of that shift can occur in year one? If there's a failure to launch that offense, despite how the players have and will rally around him, he's not going to get past year one. Now, luckily, they still have maybe the least talked about quarterback in the SEC by name of Will Rogers, who's only done record-setting things in his career. My biggest question mark is, how will the offensive linemen recruited to be in a pass-heavy offense be able to adjust to a run-heavy offense? Now, Kevin Barbay, I believe, was a very good hire at OC who ran the legs off of some great running backs at Appalachian State. It'll be a matter of just meshing everything there. This could be a team that blows up as the season gets deeper and as the media turns their back, or everything just might not work because of the players that they have. We've seen coaches in the past come in there and try and do things their way instead of what works best for the team, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Now, here's a little fun fact about the Bulldogs. 19 of their 22 starters projected on both sides of the ball are seniors. It's a mind-boggling stat. That sounds like something coming out of the COVID year. 2021 was almost the case for Arkansas having that many, mainly in the trenches, I might add, of those 19. Now, defensively, they have Jaden Crumdy. He seems like he's been there for at least a century, and he did have a slight drop-off last season, but I'd bet he ends up their top defensive lineman. Nathan Pickering, he's also backing in there. I bet he would like a spot in that conversation. Now, those guys on the interior combined for 57 career starts and over 150 tackles. So there's the notability. They're also hefty guys. I mean, what else do you expect as an SEC interior guy? Their secondary is another story. They lost Forbes to the draft. There's more questions than answers at that corner spot, but they do bring back Ferge. Esias Ferge, I do believe, is his name, and he's back for his grad year. If other teams learn to take advantage of that inexperience back there while the offense is trying to find their footing, it could be a bumpy start. Now, looking at their schedule, over-under of 6.5. They open against Southeastern Louisiana, Arizona, LSU, at South Carolina, Bama, Western Michigan, at Arkansas, at Auburn, Kentucky, at A&M, versus Southern Miss and Ole Miss to end the season. Best case scenario is they come out, Will Rogers adapts, they have a really successful run offense, and then Will Rogers just keeps you balanced. The defense is as good as expected. Just another Zach Arnett, tough, gritty defense. 9-3. And it's the most unpredictable team in the SEC in my eyes, which means their worst-case scenario is 4-8. If nothing works and Zach Arnett gets booted out the door and they go try and recruit a new coach, I'm not too far off of it with my prediction to say. I have them going 5-7. Do they win? Their over-under for SEC wins, I believe, is 1.5. So you just got to bet on them to win 2 SEC games, but I don't even know if that happens. You win your non-con games, Western Michigan, Southeastern Louisiana, Arizona, Southern Miss. Boom, there's 4. But then do you have the confidence to say that they can win 2 of those SEC games? I can't. I can't. So we'll move on to A&M. Final team here. And as mentioned with Ole Miss, this could be another one of those teams where the slightest dip in success could spell disaster for the team. It doesn't feel like Jimbo is a coach that the current players would fight for to the very end, and another start like last season could be where the big Aggie heads start regret giving all that money back when Manziel brought the extra attention to Aggieland. All that to say, if Wegman doesn't perform at quarterback, then it'll be a very interesting to see who throws blame at who. It might even bleed over to the defensive side with the hiring of DJ Durkin. Yeah, I almost said Dave Doran. That's the head coach at, NC State. Talked about them way too many times on the show somehow. It all bleeds together. And now, I'm not the biggest fan of DJ Durkin being hired at DC. Alongside a lot more people seem to agree with that sentiment. Now, the big news out of camp is that the injury to All-American freshman tight end Donovan Green, it looked like he was going to be the starter for his second year in a row, but he ended up tearing his ACL last week and will return and will turn the spot over to a very young but, quote, very talented tight end room. Jimbo said that he's fully confident, and I think he should be. You have Danny Platt. He's a fantastic true freshman. He's a member of the 247 2023 Freaks list. Second time I've brought that up in the show. So keep a watch on him to do what Green did last season. Step in, just take that role by storm. Now, the run defense was a question last season, and they went to the portal and addressed the secondary instead. Before I talk those guys, they bring back McKinley Jackson on the inside, a mountain of a man, and it'll be year 2 for former top 10 player Walter Nolan. So they're very solid on the interior of that line. No questions there. The edge rushers last year were super young, so we'll see what kind of a jump they make from year 1 to year 2, normally the biggest jump you'll see. Now, that said, they did bring in some guys that will be instant starters in the secondary. Josh DeBerry, Tony Grimes, Sam McCall. I would be very confident in saying 2 of those guys, 2 of the 3, start, and all 3 definitely will play a significant role. I really like Josh DeBerry from Boston College. There's also some questions on the offensive line for health matters. Bryce Foster is a huge piece for them at center, who they need back and fully healthy to lead that line, or it could be a quick problem for them again, as they really struggled to run the ball last season as well. If they can stay healthy, their offensive line, I think, is sneaky good. And Bryce Foster is a future NFL guy. I believe he went down in week 2 last year. Maybe it was after that. So no telling, but he was out for the season. So big-time guy for them. Looking at their schedule, their over-unders at 8.5, all the way back up there. Open against New Mexico, at Miami, versus ULM. Auburn, at Arkansas. Bama, at Tennessee. South Carolina, at Ole Miss. Mississippi State, Abilene Christian, and at LSU. Best case scenario, you get all-star play out of Connor Wegman, Bobby Petrino, who I didn't even talk about when mentioning him. Go me. Bobby Petrino calls the offense and actually gets the reins from Jimbo. Might have to, jerk him out of his hand a few times. Take that out of context. And, well, the defensive side shows a lot of progression. All those young guys step up. I think they can go 10-2 as their best case, but worst case, everything falls apart. Connor Wegman's not the best quarterback Jimbo's ever seen, as he's said multiple times. They go 5-7. And my prediction, not much better. I think they go 7-5. And I look at that stretch of Auburn, Arkansas, Bama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Ole Miss. They might lose the majority of those games. And then you have LSU to end the year, which is not going to be easy, especially if LSU lives up to the hype. And so that does it with all the camp intel, record predictions. You got it. And if you didn't hear the TwitterCon, it's because I need to scheme up some new names, because XCon just sounds like a really, really bad Comic-Con that I wouldn't want to be there. And then you try to use a bunch of other titles that involve X to go look at all the Arkansas fans, all the action over there on the app, and it just doesn't sound right. X-rated hogs? No one wants to hear that. So if you can come up with an idea for that, I don't know, please let me know, because I'll keep the segment some way or another. I'll scheme. But let's go ahead and look at the lines for week 0. as I'm recording this on Monday, the games start very, very soon. So let's talk about that Hawaii at Vanderbilt line that I mentioned I like so much. Vanderbilt currently favored by 17.5. I mean, I don't know how, and they're at home. I don't know how you don't hammer the Vanderbilt over. When you look at last year's game, fighting the jet lag, Vanderbilt had to go down to Honolulu and on national TV hung 63 points and only gave up 10. The only thing that might work against them is their stadium's not ready yet. Like, really not ready. So, well, they got less than a week. So we'll see how that goes. Hammer the Vandy over there. Notre Dame versus Navy. Notre Dame favored by 20.5, and that game's over in Dublin. So the Irish going to Ireland. How fitting is that? Is Navy really that improved? I don't have any confidence in them. I'll take the over on Notre Dame there. Then you have San Jose State at USC, and USC is a 30-point favorite. I'm a big Chevon Cordero guy, which is San Jose State's quarterback. That's not to mention they also have Jay Butterfield, an Oregon transfer back there. I believe Chevon has won the job, but, I mean, if he screws up, Jay Butterfield's an awesome backup for a non-Power 5 school. Now, looking at that line, 30 points is a big mountain, but San Jose State defense isn't that great. They lost a lot of guys back there last year. Fehoko, I don't think, is returning. But I still got to go with San Jose State to cover that 30. Now, the over-under is set at 64.5 as of Saturday when I got this all down. I like to bet on that and go over on that as well. Now, I like the Fighting Corderos to go out there and put up some numbers on USC, especially this early in the season. You're going to see the offenses maybe shine a little bit more. So, there's that input. Get down into some other games that look less impressive. Florida International, FIU at Louisiana Tech. Louisiana Tech, 10.5-point favorites, which this might be a game to watch as an Arkansas fan because, I mean, you play FIU at the end of the season, no matter how many points we'll be favored by. Now, my gut says that this is about a 10-point game on paper, and it being week one, that might be a coin flip on this, but I'll still take the Louisiana Tech over. You have Ohio. The Bobcats will go down to San Diego State, and San Diego State only favored by 3. That's blasphemous to me. Now, outside of Vanderbilt, this one is probably the easiest line to take a shot at. You have Rourke. If he's returning, he's a fantastic quarterback at Ohio. I believe he is. And they have a really nice, he'll be a sophomore running back too. So their offense might put up some points, but they're not a match for San Diego State, at least to cover. So hammer that 3 points in favor of San Diego State. Then you have the brawl of UMass at New Mexico State. State's favored by 8. And now for the sickos out there, this game is on Prime ESPN. And UMass is an absolute landfill as far as the quarterback play went last year. And yet they still almost beat Arkansas State. Mind-boggling. So they're landfill material. And that New Mexico State, they at least have a pulse. I don't know if they get that quarterback back from last season. And if they do, it's an easy over for New Mexico State. And then you have UTEP. They're favored by 1 at Jacksonville State in the CUSA opener for both teams. And I would want to leave this game alone at all costs. But give me Jacksonville State to cover and win, clearly, because, can't tie. So, quickly, before I wrap up, what do I want to see versus Western Carolina in Week 1? Well, I want to see a dominant run game. I want to see Rocket get out there. How improved is Rashad Dubinion? We've heard so much about it. Is Dom Johnson back fully healthy? He's got to get that knee brace off at some point that Coach Pittman said he's clear to go. How many yards do they run for? 250? 300? What would you think is successful as far as that yard mark goes? Is the defensive line as advertised? They're not going to have struggles against Western Carolina. But how many sacks do they pile up? Do they struggle to run the ball? Western Carolina is not a great FCS team. Now, does Western Carolina have success throwing the ball deep? And if not, who's the one stepping up at safety? Is it Al Walcott? I'd like to believe it is. Is Hudson Clark in his new physical beast mode form? Is Hud Island going to resurface? And I look at safety. I don't really have any doubts at corner as it stands. Is Snacks thrown all over the field? Is he the one out there hitting guys and putting them in graves? It hurt a lot more in War Memorial because of that turf. Might as well go ahead and get thrown up against the cement that's inside the stadium concourse. But finally, not that we should punt at all in that game, But is Mac Fletcher consistent at punting as Camp suggests with his big O Australian leg? We'll have to see. So before I get on out of here, I want to rehash. Hawgin the Mic can be heard on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and if you're listening/watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Share it with whoever you want. And if you want to follow me personally on Instagram, it's at Brady_Michael, Michael, replace the I with a 1. Over on Twitter/X at BMichael with Michael the same way. And if you want to read my articles that are probably going to start dying down with me back at Arkansas State for my senior year, and it looks to be hellish as far as the workload goes. So just pray that I can get back over here and keep the show going consistently. You can find them over there at fifthquarter.net. Just search /author and /I'm Just Brady, and that'll be where it takes you. Click on them. It gets me a little bit of money, and I need it. So I appreciate you all listening. My name is Brady Michael, and I am no longer hogging the mic. I'm going to go suffer in this last little bit of Jonesboro sunlight. I'll catch you guys next time.